Welcome to the Temple of Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star. And this will be our fourth and final class in our four-part class series called Sacred Numbers, Words of Power, where we've been talking about the symbolism of the Hebrew alphabet and numbers and the analysis of words and formulae and all that. So, after having gone through the basics in class one, and then looked in kind of a deep dive into number in two, and then a deep dive into words and formulae in class three, now we're going to try to synthesize some of that stuff, have a few high-level reflection on some of the things, and then also just kind of put this stuff into practice and show how it actually shows up in some of Crowley's writings and in the Holy Books. So before we get into the main subject that will be, or kind of main part of today's class, I just wanted to do a couple of things that didn't really fit in to some of the stuff earlier. So first thing here, we have the planets, the 7 classical planets and their association with number. So on the left, we have the main associations with number here, and this is what I'm calling like the kind of sephirothic or like cosmological associations of the planets through number here, right? So 1, of course, is Kether, 2 is Hokmah, and so on, down the tree. And so what we're mainly interested here is 3 through 9. And then these are the planets in order, from slowest. This is called in order. The planets in order from their slowest, Saturn, to the fastest, the Moon. And so they're attributed in order to the numbers 3 through 9. And this is, of course, the main primary numbers that are associated with each one of the planets, and we'll see how that gets developed. Those numbers get developed further in just a moment. I also thought it was just interesting. I was reading through. In preparing for this class, I was looking through a couple chapters in Agrippa in book 2. I noticed that he had this other set of number associations with planets that we don't typically use, but there's no reason that you couldn't use them. So this is more just kind of a suggestion of the fact that there's other ways that this can happen, and you can always look back into the tradition or into aspects of the tradition that maybe don't get quite as much time on stage in modern magic. But that they're all totally legitimate, that you could mine there. So let's see. Just real quick, go through some of Agrippa's associations. So with the number 1, right, and this is very Agrippa's associations here are very deeply Pythagorean. So when he's thinking about the numbers 1 through 10, he's really thinking about the classical Pythagorean associations with those numbers, and then making associations of the planets to the meanings of those of the Pythagorean interpretation of those numbers, right? So you have the monad, the source, right, the one from which all things descend, and so he associates with the sun, as the king of the stars, and Jupiter as the father of the gods, right? Can both be associated with the monad, and we saw Zeus or Jupiter as the monad back in our second class. Now for number 2, this is interesting. He associates 2 with the moon because it's the second light, right? The sun and moon are the 2 lights or the 2 luminaries. So if the sun is 1, then he associates the moon with 2 as the second thing. 2 in Pythagorean thought is also associated with the dyad, or the dyad is associated with matter in Pythagorean thought. So that may be part of why he's bringing the moon in here, because the moon is associated with incarnation and things like coming into, taking on bodily form. Also, he's doing pairs of numbers. Mars and Saturn as a pair, he's associating with 2 because they're the 2 malefics. And again, there may be an association between like matter and the idea of the malefics there. Now for 3, he's using these 3 planets, Jupiter, Sun, and Venus. So Jupiter and Venus, of course, are the 2 benefics, and then the Sun, as the source of light and life. This is something that shows up a lot in like Renaissance material, especially in Marsilio Ficino's work. He calls those 3 planets the 3 graces, and they're really important in Ficino's magic, and especially Ficino suffered from melancholy all of his life. He had Aquarius rising with Saturn in Aquarius, and was a sufferer of melancholy, and so a lot of his magic is about trying to overcome melancholy, and so those 3 planets play a big role there. He also associates the sun, and you'll see that some of these planets have multiple number associations here, right? So the sun for 1, the sun is also 4 because the sun is the cause of the 4 seasons. He associates Mercury with the number 5 because it's 2 plus 3, as we saw in the Pythagorean. The 2 is the female number, and 3 is the male number. So 2 plus 3 is female and male, and Mercury, classically was considered to be hermaphroditic. Now Venus, as the multiplication of 2 and 3, the multiplication of male and female, Venus associated with 6, for generation and marriage, and I think the implication here is sexuality, of course, here too. let's say then Saturn is associated with rest, and that's the seventh day of the week, which in Hebrew is the Sabbath, right? And Saturn, the Hebrew name for Saturn is Shabtai, like it's the same word. So Saturn is associated with Saturday and the day of the holy day, the day of rest. Let's see, Jupiter is justice. I think we talked a little bit about 8 associated with justice because when you divide it by 2, it keeps dividing into evens, right? It's 4 plus 4, and then each of those 4s is 2 plus 2, and each of those 2s is 1 plus 1. So it's kind of like even all the way down. Then Moon as 9, the uttermost receptacle. 9 has the association of the idea of like limits or the end, and the Moon is the last planet before the elemental world. So in like the soul's descent through the planetary spheres, the Moon is the final sphere moved through. And finally, for 10, we have the Sun and the idea of the Pythagorean idea that the 10 symbolizes the return to unity, and so that would be the Sun. The 10 is associated with the monad essentially, and then Mars he calls the end of all things, and he's thinking of, I think, associating Mars with death here, and with finality, which you might normally more associate with Saturn, but he's associating Mars there. But in any case, I just thought that was interesting that there's other ways that we could think about this besides the primary ways that we do it. But the stuff on the left is what's most important here for you to know and for what we're about to talk about. So that's actually in chapter 21 of book 2. And then in the very next chapter, he starts talking about what are called magic squares, which are also known as kameyas. And so you can go and check out the chapter and read what else he has to say, but here's just like the opening paragraph from Agrippa here. He says, it is affirmed by magicians that there are certain tables of numbers distributed to the 7 planets, which they call the sacred tables of the planets, endowed with many and very great virtues of the heavens, inasmuch as they represent that divine order of celestial numbers impressed upon celestials by the ideas of the divine mind, by means of the soul of the world and the sweet harmony of those celestial rays, signifying according to the proportion of effigies. I think by effigies here he means like what we would call like sigils nowadays. The proportion of effigies, supracelestial intelligences, which can no other way be expressed than by the marks of numbers and characters. So now we'll look at numbers, and then we'll briefly look at characters after that. Magic squares are such a huge topic. At some point, I'll just have to do like a whole, an hour and a half class just all about magic squares, because there's really like a lot of really interesting stuff here. So we're just going to do some of the basics here. And this is something I've been trying to stick into different classes over time and just never quite have enough space for it. So we'll have to come back to this at some point for a deeper look. But yeah, let's just quickly go through all 7 magic squares. So first of all, Saturn, as we saw, was associated with 3, in Binah on the tree of life. So for Saturn, we're going to have a 3x3 magic square. So what magic squares are, and that's the magic square you see on the lower left there for Saturn. So this is a square table with the numbers 1 through however many squares there are in that table, arranged so that every row, every column, and every diagonal, the true diagonal is like 2, 5, and 8, not like 9 and 3, right? So every row, column, and true diagonal sums to the same number. And so from this table, we can derive 4 numbers for each one of the planets. So the first one is just the number that we'd already associated there. This is called the order, right? And so this is just 3 here, right? Because there's a 3x3 table. So this is the order of 3, and 3 is said to be the first number of Saturn. Now, the second number will be the square, right? So it's 3 squared, and because we have the table here is 3x3, right? So there's 9 squares, and we're arranging the numbers 1 through 9. So 9 is the second number of Saturn. Now, the third number is going to be whatever that value is that the rows, columns, and diagonals add to. And you can actually just calculate this. If you calculate the whole sum here, the 4th number is just the sum of the numbers 1 through 9 here. So if you just take the whole sum and then divide by the order, that'll give you the 3rd number. You don't actually have to draw the tree to draw the table to be able to calculate that, right? So the sum of 1 through 9 is 45, and then 45 divided by 3 is 15. So that's going to be our 3rd number, is 15. And then Agrippa gives a number of different divine names and other Hebrew words that sum to these values that are then associated with the planets. And most interesting and most relevant for us here is the names of the planetary intelligences and the planetary spirits. Now you'll remember these intelligences and spirits if you've that looked into astrological magic or attended the astrological magic class series that I did earlier this year. But we didn't talk about the fact that the numbers, the values of the names of the intelligence and spirit are relevant here. So for Saturn, the planetary intelligence is Agiel and the planetary spirit Zazel, and both of those sum to 45. Right, you have 1 plus 3 plus 10 plus 1 plus 30 is 45, and 7 plus 7 plus 1 plus 30 is also 45. So the intelligence and the spirit are their names are like numerically keyed to this planet. All right, now we have the square for Jupiter, and so we're just we're going to go in descending Chaldean order here or there for from slowest to fastest, which will also be each table will be one square larger in each direction. So for Jupiter, our association with Jupiter is the number 4, so it's a 4 by 4 table. 4 squared is 16, right? And we're arranging the numbers 1 through 16 in the table. And then each row, column, and diagonal will sum to 34. And then the sum of 1 to 16 is 136. So 4, 16, 34, and 136 are numbers of Jupiter. And so these are numbers that, if you're keeping you're creating your own kind of version of Sefer Sephiroth, or just keeping track of important numbers. These are all numbers that are associated with the planet. So if you're looking at some Hebrew word and you add it up and it sums to 136, well, maybe there's like a Jupiterian significance there because 136 is a Jupiterian number, right? So you can just use this as information for your own, Kabbalistic research. These numbers are all associated with those planetary powers. Now, for the intelligence here, the name Yaphiel varies a bit. I've seen this spelled a bunch of different ways, even some ways that don't sum to 136. But here's 2 variations that I've seen that do sum to 136. You can see they're quite similar. For the one on the top there, you've got a Vav and then no Aleph, and then on the bottom, the lower number or the lower version of the name, you've got a Hey and an Aleph. So Vav is obviously 6, and then Hey is 5, Aleph is 1. So they sum to the same thing there. And then the planetary spirit, Hismael, and both of those names sum to 136. And you will see some variation. Some of this is just corruption in like older magical texts, especially with the Hebrew, especially in like the 17th century and things like that. Printers were not good about reproducing Hebrew accurately. So sometimes these things have to be reconstructed. And there's also just variations in the tradition. Sometimes these may be like from older traditions that are like respelled somewhat so that they add up to a certain number. And people will have different preferences about whether they like the older names or the names that they feel are more Kabbalistically appropriate. So there's variance there. And as always, we encourage people to do your own research and to experiment and to think critically about this stuff. All right, now for Mars, we have 5 by 5 square. And so our numbers for Mars will be 5 squared, 25. The sum of all the rows and columns is going to be 65, which is interesting. 65 is the value of the name Adonai and some other interesting words. And now we can also add a martial significance to that number as well here. And then the sum of 1 to 25 is 325. And then we have the planetary intelligence Graphiel and then the planetary spirit Bartzabel, which both also sum to 325. Now, as you'll see that so far we've seen all the names sum to the 4th number, but that'll start to change as we get some larger numbers in here. And yeah, that'll start to change right now. All right, so now we come to the sun. The sun is associated with the number 6. So it's a 6 by 6 table, and our numbers will be 6. 6 squared is 36. And then each row, column, and diagonal will sum to 111, and then the whole sum is 666, which is a number that we talked about in our 2nd class already. And of course, this is the primary way that 666 gets associated with the sun. And there's all that Crowley saying, you can call me little sunshine, all that sort of stuff. This is the main way that the 666 gets associated with the sun. And so we have 2 planetary, we have planetary intelligence, Nachiel, which sums to 111. So this is the first time we've seen one of these names sum to something other than the 4th number. So Nachiel sums to the 3rd number of the sun. And then the planetary spirit, the spirit of the sun is Soroth, which sums to 666. All right, next we have Venus in a 7 by 7 table here. So our numbers for Venus will be 7. 7 squared is 49. Each row, column, and diagonal will sum to 175. And then the whole sum of 1 to 49 is 1,225. So these four numbers are all associated with Venus. And, you could analyze these numbers too, rather than, I said, oh, if you find a number that adds to a word or something that adds to one of these numbers, you can then say, oh, there's a planetary, significance there. But you could also just kabbalistically investigate all these numbers. Maybe sit down and take these four numbers of Venus and look up each one of those numbers in Sefer Sephiroth, or use any other kabbalistic, techniques and tools that you have to analyze those numbers and see maybe how analysis of those numbers or words that add up to those numbers, how that can tell you something about the nature of the planet Venus and her powers. All right, and then we have two names here, Hagiel and Kedemel. Let's see, and those, Hagiel sums to, 49, and then Kedemel sums to 175. So in this case, we have the second number and the third number. All right, then getting larger here, Mercury is an 8 by 8 table. So our numbers for Mercury are 8. 8 squared is 64. Each row, column, and diagonal will sum to 260. And then the whole sum, the sum of 1 to 64 is 2080. So for our planetary intelligence, we have, oops, I wrote Hagiel there. I was copying from the last table. I'll make sure to correct that. That should say Tiriel there. The Hebrew is correct. I just didn't change the English there on the right. And then the planetary spirit, which is correct both here, is Tephtharthareth, which is a fun name to say. And a friend of mine always says that in the voice of, what's his name, Sylvester, the cat from the cartoons. So I always hear his voice as Sylvester in my head when I see that name. And Tephtharthareth may very well be a name that is actually created specifically to add up to that number. It's pretty obvious that, how that works out, right? It's just Resh's Tav's and a pay to get to 2080. And then Tiriel sums to 260. All right, and then finally, we have the 9 by 9 square for the moon. So numbers for the moon will be 9. 9 squared is 81. Each row, column, and diagonal will sum to 369. And then our whole sum is 1 to 81, which is 3,321. So for the planetary intelligence, we actually have a name here that sums to 3,321. And so this is almost certainly a name that was specifically created to add up to this number. And this is one that you'll see a lot of corruptions and errors in the giving of this number, but I believe this is the correct form here. And this is Malka Betarshashim Ad Beruach Sakarim, which I'm forgetting what that means off the top of my head, but I know I talked about it in the Astrological Magic class series. And then finally, for the planetary spirit, you have Chasmodai, which sums to 369. So there you go. So there's a whole set of 4 numbers for each planet, as well as a little look into how the names of the planetary intelligences and spirits, numerically and kabbalistically hook into the planets that they're directly tied to, which is just an interesting thing to reflect on. That fact, I think, tells you something about the way that magic works, and the way that we're doing that, and the way that we're thinking about that, and what's important, and all that. So that's just an interesting thing to reflect to on its own. All right, and then just a little taste of some of the other things that are involved in magic squares. We're not going to go into this a lot in depth. This is just 2 facing pages from the 1650 English edition of Agrippa. So let's see. Oh, so one really interesting thing you can do is, so we got the Saturn up here at the top. And so you see in the top left here, that's the table of Saturn, exactly as we saw it a few slides back. But then what Agrippa also does is he does it in Hebrew. So he just takes each number and just, spells that, or writes that number, in Hebrew letters, right? So for 4, he has Daleth, then Teth for 9, Beth for 2. And so you can do this if you're constructing a magic square. The classical use for magic squares is to be engraved on like a sheet of metal, as a talisman. But there's a lot of creative things that you can do. Crowley uses in his the ritual that he wrote for the evocation of the spirit of Mars, Bartzabel. He makes the top of the altar like a 5 by 5. The magic square of Mars is the top of the altar. So you could make, you could take a nice sheet of paper and paint or draw, the magic square of the planet, to make it to the size of your altar, and then put that on top of your altar for doing like a planetary ritual. So there's a lot of other creative things that you can do here. with these tables. You could even just like meditate on them. Choose a time when that planet is, maybe the day and hour of that planet, and then meditate on the table as a way of trying to have some contact with that power. Right? There's a lot of things you could do here. And what you might like to do is take the table and convert it into Hebrew characters, if that gives an extra like a magical charge for you. It's not necessary, but it's something you could do. And of course, that opens up. You could take that table and look at what tarot cards those letters correspond to, and other things there, and that could give you even more sort of food for Kabbalistic analysis of these things. And then this is what we're not really going to talk about much here, but there's also seals and characters here. So you'll see this symbol here. That's like the seal of Saturn, and you can see how that would be drawn on like a 3x3 grid, so that the different points are touching like each square of the magic square. And then for the intelligence and spirit, each one has like a sigil here, and these are drawn. Sometimes it's not obvious that they get like rotated or slightly like kind of changed in their shape or something like that sometimes. So it's not always exactly obvious how it's happening, but they're connecting different points in the magic squares. So there's Saturn, and then you can see like Jupiter here. And so again, you can see how the seal of Jupiter would fit onto the table, right? So the circle, would be like there. And then the little circles at the ends, would touch the corners. And then like this kind of cross in the center would touch those central 4 squares. And then there you've got the sigil of the intelligence and spirit of Jupiter, and then the example of Mars there over on the right. So yeah, you can check out Agrippa for more on that. And yeah, like I said, we can do a deeper dive into this at some point, because it's pretty cool. And you get these cool sigils and characters and seals and everything out of it. Okay, yeah, so that, again, that's just a kind of introduction to magic squares there. And, just the way that we get some of these extra numbers associated with each one of the planets through them. All right, so that I originally intended that to be in the second class. It just didn't fit in there, but I'm glad we've done it. We've done it now. So yeah, so let's get into the main subject of today's class here. So as I mentioned in the first class, this idea of like the sword and the cup was symbols that I was using to talk about how I felt that my own practice of like literal Qabalah had sort of shifted over time. I felt that when I first started doing it, it was all with the sword, the magical weapon of the sword, and then over time I felt like I started to be able to do Qabalah with the cup rather than with the sword. Those were the symbols that occurred to me. So yeah, let's kind of talk through that in a few different ways there. But I found that a useful way to think about this, and it's a useful way of approaching, what these things have to do with the spiritual path and the magical path. Now, obviously, in some sense, this is just like the part of the language of symbol that we use, when we're doing rituals, or like we just saw with the magic squares and calling in the names of the planetary intelligences and the spirits. All this stuff is related. So you could think of it simply as that. This is like the language the symbolic language that we're using. But I think there's more than that as well going on here. So so the first bullet point I've got here, I've said from analysis to reception, scattering to depth. So again, this is like the sword would be analysis, and then reception would be like the cup. So where I felt like, and again, the kind of idea of like scattering, the sword like cuts and divides things, or the idea of the air, air like scattering leaves, right? There's that sort of sense. And then the cup, and with water, with depth. So I felt like early on, doing this stuff, in the first couple of years of practicing this, I could just sort of generate a lot of stuff. Like I could put out a lot of numbers, a lot of different names and words. And sometimes I found interesting stuff, but more often than not, it was just kind of chaotic. Or when I did find things that were interesting, it never seemed to, it was just revealing things that, that were just really obvious or kind of like built into the system. But slowly I started to feel like, I could use these techniques to actually like receive information and actually learn things. And especially, early on, if I would produce some new, I'd find a couple words that added up to each other, or find a way of like transforming a word into some other word, I would just think like, is that good? Is that right? Or is this just nonsense? Like I didn't feel like I had a sense of, like a compass or something like that to be able to know sort of when I was just churning out a bunch of sort of meaningless stuff and when I was actually on track, unless, I had some particular knowledge from something I had studied. But over time, I felt like there was an intuitive like sense of this, and an intuitive sense of how these techniques are used, that was kind of guiding me in this process. And I was noticing like what things were important, and even having the intuitive sense of like going in a certain direction that just more and more often really paid off. And I was doing some personal Kabbalistic work recently, and just sort of reflecting on how much it really has become almost a kind of like divinatory tool for me, that I can, I fairly confidently, just take a word or like a phrase from the old the Hebrew Bible or something like that, and be able to actually like extract what seems to me anyways like useful and interesting information that often connects up to a lot of other things. But it was definitely the development of a kind of like intuitive sense, and the sense, again, not that I was just generating a whole bunch of stuff, but that I was going deeper and deeper into something and revealing the kind of hidden layers of depth and meaning. And again, with the idea of like simplicity and complexity, I talked about this before. I really think that your like Kabbalistic proof, something like that, should be as simple as possible, and that the more complex you get, it's going to have to be that much better, and you're going to have to really give off more stuff. And I think that every step, every transformation, every word, every number that you're using, they should all be meaningful. So if you look at some of Crowley's like really big kind of complex analyses, you'll see that every little step has meaning, and it's always like kind of clustering around a central meaning. He's not shooting off in 1,000 different directions, right? He's always showing like, okay, you have like these 10 different things, but they're all pointing to one thing. Each one of them is meaningful. Each step makes sense, and it's all going in the same direction. I've seen a lot of kind of bad Kabbalah, like on forums or on the internet or something like that. And there tends to be a lot of calculation, but it's not until the very end that you get any meaning, and you have these kind of intermediate steps of just like juggling numbers around. And that to me, I think is pointless complexity. And I think, again, as I said, I think that a lot of the art of this is finding very simple little things that are really meaningful, just 2 words that add to the same value. And then, like we saw with Echad and Aheve, unity and love, both adding to the number 13. I mean, that's such a simple, basic, elementary thing. And yet there's so much there, and that idea of unity and love being equated with each other. I mean, that forms so much of the backbone of our kind of spiritual and magical philosophy. There's really you could write a whole book about that idea, from that one simple little Kabbalistic thing. Let's see, what else I got here? Oh yeah, the Kabbalah and divination. I think that, like I was saying just a second ago, that it kind of started to feel more like doing divination, that practicing these techniques felt more like divination. And I think that this practice and divination can really feed into each other very well. I think that doing divinatory practice, like like reading the tarot or geomancy, astrology too, and like reading astrological charts, maybe in a slightly different sense, but especially I think something like tarot really trains like the muscles and faculties. And so I think I imagine that, for myself, my own like practices of divination over the years helped to build the faculty that transformed my my Kabbalistic techniques into this deeper level. I don't think these things. This would be a very difficult thing to do as this kind of like Kabbalah as like an entire path, but rather I think it interacts well with other practices like meditation, magical practice, practicing divination. I think it hooks into those things really well and connects to them really well too. Obviously, the better your Kabbalah, the better you're going to be at reading tarot, because each one of those tarot cards has a Kabbalistic association, and the quicker, just you put down the card, and if you immediately have, 20 Kabbalistic associations waiting in your mind, you can pick the one that's going to be relevant for the reading that you're doing. And so, the 2 can really inform each other quite nicely. And I think the skills you develop in each do the same thing. And then, I was trying to come up with some kind of points of advice here. I think avoiding preconceptions. I think going into doing Kabbalistic analysis, looking for some particular result is when you start really forcing things, and things start getting really questionable. I think going in with kind of an open mind about not being sure of what you'll find, and being okay sometimes with not really being clear on what your results mean, or if your results are valid or not, keeping that kind of open mind about things, and trying to drop preconceptions. And again, lust of results, going in, I'm going to prove this particular truth, with Kabbalah. I think that's not a great way of approaching it. I think instead the open kind of sense of investigating something is going to be much more useful for you. Finally, that as divination, like practices can kind of spell out into life, and sort of every, ultimately, there's that famous clause, the famous part of an oath. I will interpret every phenomenon as a dealing of God with my soul, right? That ultimately, like everything that ever happens to you becomes a kind of divination, which that's a high level result. If you try to do that too early on, you'll just end up either going mad or just really confusing yourself, one or the other. But ultimately, this idea that these sort of symbols can appear to you outside of formal practice, and that we can be open and receptive to those things. I think I mentioned that idea a couple classes back of just being open to these things, and seeing, kind of the way that signs and omens, in the world will speak this language that you've that you've learned. I mean, it's also, I think David Shoemaker talks about this nicely in a couple episodes of Living Thelema, about this idea that this is also kind of language that we're using to communicate with both the lower and the higher unconscious. That the unconscious speaks the language of symbol, and so you're also developing a language that parts of your mind that you don't normally have like conscious rational access to, you can use it as a kind of like a language to be able to speak to those parts of the mind. And that's another way of thinking about some of these signs and omens, rather than things that like some other entity put in the world to tell you something. Maybe it's your own unconscious that's picking out that particular thing rather than some other thing as meaningful. And so you could think about it that way too. And of course, ultimately, as above, so below, those aren't actually two separate things, but just two different perspectives on the same phenomenon. And then finally, I just grabbed this quote from the Book of the Law here. Also, reason is a lie, for there is a factor infinite and unknown, and all their words are skew wise. And I think this is something that Crowley talks about a few times, the idea that the practice of Kabbalah and that has to be kind of balanced by a recognition of how totally absurd it is. Like that, I mean, the Hebrew language isn't some like divinely ordained thing. Well, unless all languages are divinely ordained, right? The actual process by which languages come about, and even the tarot and other symbols come about, there's a kind of just contingent, historical, relative kind of contingency to it, and so there is something. There is that quality to it, and then all of this stuff is kind of crazy or is nonsense. But that somehow, if you hold that idea in mind and sort of practice it anyways, I think that gives a really pure form of like not having lust of result, because it lets you hold this thing very lightly without becoming attached to it. But that somehow that knowing that truth at the same time as knowing the system deeply allows it to operate in its most pure form. Certainly, this I've heard some people talk about the idea of how like divination, a lot of divination systems grew out of games of chance, and that divination may work best when there's some of that attitude of a game towards it, that you're sort of playing, you're playing make believe in a way, which creates like a space for something else to come through, but you're not becoming overly attached to something. You're let's play this game, where each one of these cards has a meaning, and I'll ask a question and shuffle up the cards and put them down, and then the cards will answer my question. But having that kind of like lightness of a game to it, rather than a kind of weighty, serious, kind of attached sense, I think can create a really nice sort of open space for something to happen and something to come through. But then even when that happens, to not get overly attached to it, to keep some of that lightness. And I think, yeah. So I'll just leave, but I think that same attitude that I think is so appropriate to divination is really appropriate here. So yeah, some of that attitude of a game, or knowing how absurd and ridiculous this whole thing is at the same time that you're doing it, and getting real meaningful information out of it. Yeah, okay, and then I guess that sums up, I think, most of what I wanted to say. We might come back to some of these if we have time a little later. But then I just wanted to. I was originally going to use this slide here as the opening slide in our first class, but I ended up rearranging things a bit, so I just stuck it in here now. This is a great quote from John Dee from his Monas Hieroglyphica, which I thought could almost make a nice like motto, for this whole class series here, or for the practice of this sort of Kabbalah that we've been talking about. And he says, "Subluatus ergo in caelum oculus Kabbalisticus," which means we must raise to heaven our Kabbalistic eyes. And so I was thinking about like a lot of what we've been doing in this class series and this study is like the development of the Kabbalistic eyes. It's learning to see and learning to distinguish forms that we've been training our sight. But then ultimately what you need to do then is direct your eyes. You need to raise your eyes to heaven. Now we don't need to understand this as like a Christian heaven or anything like that, of course, but the divine realm, the celestial realm, however you want to think about it, that we're developing these Kabbalistic eyes, but then we want to look at the deeper things and divine things. We're not just learning these things for their own sake, but we're training a kind of vision so that we can then direct that vision towards things that we want to see more clearly. So I just thought it was a nice kind of motto that we could have for this whole practice. And again, a nice way of thinking about what we're doing here is the development of Kabbalistic eyes, which ultimately are a tool to be used in your own spiritual path, or to be directed towards the divine, both within and without. Yeah, okay, let's just move on here. If I think of anything else, I'll come back to that. But yeah, let's now look at the way some of these techniques are used. And first we'll look at a few chapters from the Book of Lies, and then we'll move over to the Thelemic Holy Books. I've got a bunch of stuff here. We'll see how much time we have. We've got about an hour left. So I'm sure we can get through at least a lot of it. Yeah, but we'll just sort of jump right into it here. So the Book of Lies is Liber 333. 333 is the value of the name Corazon, the demon of the abyss, which I discussed in the class series, the single class I did on the vision and the voice. I talked about Corazon there, and so you can check that out if you're not familiar with that. And of course, the number 333 as Corazon is very significant as half of 666. And so where 666 is like the sun, the clear light and energy and life of the new aeon, Corazon is like the division of that, right? And again, where the sun is like oneness and unity and centrality, Corazon is the breaking up and scattering of that thing. And so the Book of Lies is numbered after Corazon. Yeah, and then, Crowley gives a couple of different kind of subtitles and things like that, but in at least in one place, Crowley calls it the Book of Lies, falsely so called, which is really nice because this is like the liar's paradox, right? If the Book of Lies is falsely called the Book of Lies, that means that it's the Book of Truth. But if it's the Book of Truth, then it really is the Book of Lies, like it says. But then if it's right? And so. Right, like the liar's paradox, the ultimate form of the liar's paradox, right, is like this sentence is false, and so it's false if it's true and true if it's false, right? And so he has this same kind of paradox here. And so even though he's calling it the Book of Lies, there's so much. Almost every there's a couple of very silly kind of joke or almost like trick sort of chapters, but most of the 93 chapters in the book are actually quite serious. I mean, there's jokes and riddles and puns and things like that, but they really are a very clear exposition of a lot of Crowley's thinking, especially in the years following his experience crossing the abyss in the vision and the voice, and it's a very like kind of mature perspective or mature like summary of a lot of the insights that he has in the process of the scrying of the aethers. But something that was so important to Crowley here is the idea of the that all that truth that lies on the far side of the abyss, all that supernal truth, cannot be expressed by number or by language or by symbol. And so everything that he said in this book about those things is false because they're necessarily lies, right? Anything that he can say about spiritual truth is not real, right? Is false, is a lie. And so part of this is a kind of this paradox here isn't just Crowley playing with paradoxes, just for fun, but to actually try to express, some supernal truth here, and that idea that he really goes on to develop a lot, both in this book and later on, that above the abyss things are only true if they contain their own contradiction. So even the title, Book of Lies, falsely so called, it contains its own contradiction in that sense. And of course, we think of like Crowley talks about the curse of the great of Magus, that the Magus speaks truth, but at the same time also deceives by falsehood, that truth and falsehood kind of arise together, and that capital T truth is somehow beyond what we normally think of as the duality of true and false. And we'll come to that at the very end of the class today. So let's just move on here. All right, so yeah, I just selected just a few chapters that I thought nicely like illustrated some of these principles here. Just a word about the Book of Lies. It's a complex book and a difficult one. This is actually the very first Crowley book that I ever bought, and I spent an afternoon kind of flipping through it and trying to, even with the Crowley's got like commentary, facing page commentary on each chapter, but even with the commentary, I didn't understand a word of it. It was just absolute. It was interesting, and there were some phrases, that were kind of resonant or alluring, but I just couldn't make heads or tails of it. So it's actually been very satisfying over the years to now be able to read it, and especially with the help of the commentary there, to really be able to understand it. So I think it's never too early to start reading this book. Just know that if you're in your first few years of study, there's going to be things that you're not going to get and that you're not going to understand. But coming back to it, as you learn more and using that as a guide for what you need to study more and what areas of like symbolism you need to put more attention into can be a nice way of structuring some of your study. So yeah, anyways, let's just look at a few chapters here. And again, we're not going to cover these chapters in completely, but I'll just try to point out some things relevant to like what we've been doing in this class series here. All right, so this first one here is partially just setting up for the next chapter that we'll look at. You kind of have to have read this one first. There's a lot of complex kind of interconnection between some of the chapters. Oh, and also, if you're not familiar with the Book of Lies, so it's structured as, well, it's 93 chapters. The first two chapters are, I guess the first one chapter really, is just like the soldier and the hunchback. It's just a question mark and an exclamation point. Then you have chapter 0, then chapter 1, 2, 3, up to 91. And so each one is short, just like a page, often a paragraph, or even just a few sentences. And at least most of them relate directly to the chapter number. Helps to determine the, kabbalistically determines the subject of that chapter. So you can always use the chapter number as like a key to getting into the text. So this is chapter 31, and we'll remember that the divine name El, Aleph Lamed, as well as Lamed Aleph, meaning not or nothing, and that kind of duality of the void and the divine, both being represented by Aleph Lamed and the number 31. That's kind of can be our main like reference point for starting off with this. And so the chapter is called the Gerat. I think if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a garrote, as I'm sure most of you probably already know, is it's a murder weapon, right? It's like a loop of piano wire or whatever that gets hooked around someone's neck, and then they're strangled, right? So the reference to the neck here and to the cutting off at the neck, da'ath is associated with the neck here, and so the idea of like reason and rationality is associated with the neck and with da'ath and the abyss. So that's the reference in the title here. All right, so then Crowley introduces this word here, it, right? Obviously, this is just like a pronoun, but writing it in all capitals here to indicate that he's doing something special with this. Now, I think Crowley's deploying this as a kind of new version of the word that used like as a translation of the Sanskrit tat. Like in the Chandogya Upanishad, you have that phrase tat tvam asi, thou art that. Meaning, at least in the Advaita interpretation of that, that the Atman, the higher soul, is identical with Brahman, with the absolute, and so that Tat refers to the absolute. But Crowley is deploying the word it here as a kind of higher or a better word for representing that, because I think the kind of implicit criticism here of the Advaita interpretation, where in Advaita, like you have the absolute, the absolute divinity, without qualities and all that. But then you have the kind of the illusion of the world, right? That individual, like particular things are a kind of illusion, and really only the absolute is real. That the only thing that actually exists, everything else is illusion. And so there's a kind of a criticism of this could be that there's a kind of duality there, that you actually have like a real thing and a false thing. Whereas Crowley's idea here is that the absolute or the divine is actually the unity of or what he calls like the conditioned and the absolute. So the world of particular things and the divine one, that the sort of total from Kether all the way, it's not that only Kether is real, but that the entire tree, from the one all the way down to multiplicity, it represents that whole thing. And so the Kabbalistic symbolism of the name it here is definitely phallic. And so the it here, the I, this would be like yod in Hebrew. And so this Crowley says that this represents the concealed phallus. And so by phallus here, we can understand like the creative power, the power to create. And this is it in its concealed form. So the I represents the absolute. And then the T here represents the letter Tav, which is a cross. And in the tarot, Tav corresponds with the universe. And so the T is what Crowley calls like the extended phallus, meaning the creative power, like the thing that the creative power actually creates. So you have the creative point, itself, the letter Yod, and then the fully extended manifest universe as the T. And so this together, the unity of those things is it. And again, there's this kind of phallic, like sexual association here, which the Book of Lies is full of really like sexual symbolism. All right, so we'll just read the chapter. So it moves from motion into rest and rests from, or it moves from motion into rest and rests from rest into motion. So already there's a kind of paradox here that it moves into rest, right? That in itself is a kind of like contradictory idea. These it does always, for time is not. So that it does neither of these things. It does that one thing which we must express by two things, right? Because we apprehend things through, duality, right? We can only understand something to be, we only understand A by its comparison to not A. So we only, motion and rest are our perception of one thing. It does that one thing which we must express by two things, neither of which possesses any rational meaning. Yet its doing, which is no doing, and we're going to think of the Tao here, right? That idea of like the Wu Wei, the doing by not doing. Yet its doing, which is no doing, is simple and yet complex, is neither free nor necessary. For all these ideas express relation, and it, comprehending all relation in its simplicity, is out of all relation, even with itself. All this is true and false, and it is true and false to say that it is true and false. Strain forth thine intelligence, O man, O worthy one, O chosen of it, to apprehend the discourse of the master, right? The master is one who's crossed the abyss and attained to Binah, who's beyond duality and reason. For thus thy reason shall at last break down as the fetter is struck from a slave's throat. And so again, this image of the throat and da'ath, and the idea of the fetter being struck by it, that da'ath stops being, there's an idea that Crowley kind of develops here that that when rightly understood, the abyss is the child, the da'ath is the child of Hokmah and Binah, and is merely like a conduit for that divine light to flow downward into reality. But for the uninitiate, da'ath represents, all the things that it represents, like in the vision of the 10th Aether and Koranzon, and the kind of the evil of multiplicity in a sense. But when rightly understood, is merely a conduit for divine light and for the creative process. So the idea of like the fetter being struck from the slave's throat, of realizing why da'ath and knowledge and duality and reason is just part of a necessary part of the divine creative process. All right, so that explains some of the idea of it and gives us a little bit of flavor of these chapters. And now we'll see another chapter here that will use that idea of it. All right, so this is from chapter 49, right? And so remember, 49 is one of the numbers of Venus, right? It's 7 times 7. 7 squared, and some of you may also be familiar with the symbol of the 49-petaled rose, which also has the association with Venus here, and the rose is a feminine symbol and all that as well. And so this chapter here relates to the tarot card Lust, and so I just included an image of it there. All right, so let's see. So this is called Warata blossoms. The Warata is a crimson flower, so that's why Crowley's chosen it here. And it's also a lot of this book, actually, if you read it in order, there's actually a kind of narrative about his relationship with Layla Waddell, where they're together and kind of in bliss all the time, and then she leaves to go to America for her career, and then Crowley's really lonely without her, and eventually he like borrows some money from a friend to go like take a ship to go see her, and so you can actually see that narrative like playing itself out across the chapters, which is kind of funny. But anyways, so there's a bunch of like Australian symbolism here because she's Australian. And so he's obviously associating her with Babylon and with Venus here. So he says, 7 are the veils of the dancing girl in the harem of it. Obviously, there's a reference to Salome here, right, and the dance of the 7 veils. And I don't know, Crowley may be referring to like Oscar Wilde's play in particular here. But Salome and Babylon obviously have a very deep kind of symbolic resonance. 7 are the names, and 7 are the lamps beside her bed. Some of this is referenced. Some of these 7s here are references to the Book of Revelation as well. 7 eunuchs guard her with drawn swords. No man may come nigh unto her. And so, of course, this no man here is this is Nemo, which is a kind of generic name for the master of the temple. So it's not that no one can come nigh unto her, but it's that the master of the temple can come nigh unto her, right? Because she dwells in Binah, which is the sphere that the master of the temple is associated. That you become a master of the temple by attaining to Binah. In her wine cup are 7 streams of the blood of the 7 spirits of God. Again, more revelation symbolism here, as well as the cup of Babylon, which I assume most of you are fairly familiar with. And that's something I've talked about in a bunch of other classes that I've done in the past. 7 are the heads of the beast whereon she rideth. The head of an angel, the head of a saint, the head of a poet, the head of an adulterous woman, the head of a man of valor, the head of a satyr, and the head of a lion serpent. And so Crowley may be thinking of himself in particular here. Obviously, as I'm sure you all know, Crowley identified himself with the beast. So Crowley may be thinking of these 7 heads as kind of like 7 expressions of his own personality and nature. And you can see those heads right there in the tarot card there. So this is a longer chapter, and I had to split it onto 2 slides. So this is just the chapter continuing here. I just couldn't fit it on one slide. 7 letters hath her holiest name, and it is, and then we have the seal of Babylon, which we discussed. What was that in the second class? We talked about that. The 7-pointed star, the 7 letters of her name, and then the 7 sevens in the middle there that make 156, which we talked about before. So 7 letters hath her holiest name, and it is Babylon. This is the seal upon the ring that is on the forefinger of it, and it is the seal upon the tombs of them whom she hath slain. And so the idea of the masters of the temple is the ones who have poured out their blood into the grail. So the ones who have been slain by Babylon are the masters. And so this is the seal on their tombs, right? Because they've attained to Binah, which, Binah has both tomb and womb sort of symbolism here, as does Babylon herself. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding, of course is what the Binah means, right? Understanding. Let him that hath understanding count the number of Our Lady, for it is the number of a woman, and her number is 156, as we talked about. So you can really see the way that these 7s and everything are just deploying here in these sequences of 7s, references to Revelation, to the myth of Salome. So he's bringing a lot of kind of mythological references that are all resonating around these numbers. And the 7 letters of her name, the value of her name adding to 156. You can see how all this is being connected in this kind of nice poetic sort of way here. All right, let's see, a couple more chapters here from the Book of Lies. So this chapter here, this is chapter 61. I feel like this is a good almost picture of Crowley kind of in a nutshell. It's both brilliant and really annoying and kind of like juvenile and really like revelatory, kind of all at the same time. I don't know. It's extremely Crowley. All right, so chapter 61. So 61, we'll remember, is the value of Aleph, Yod, Nun, Ayin, which I realize that I'm kind of inconsistent in the way I pronounce that word. Sometimes I say like Ain, or like as in like the Ein Sof or Ein Sof, but sometimes I say Ayin as well. So anyways, just a note that I realized I've been kind of inconsistent, and other people are as well, are inconsistent about the way we pronounce that word. So anyway, so this is 61, again, meaning the Ein means not or nothing, referring to the negative that is, beyond even Kether, the primordial non-existence. But 61 is also, and I don't remember if I talked about the second class or not, but 61 is also the value of Aleph, Nun, Yod, which is Ani, which means I, or like myself. So part of the idea here is that the core or the essence of the individual self is this kind of so there's a slightly Buddhist kind of interpretation here of the self as non-existent, but that in that its non-existence, it is the same as the ultimate nature of reality. All right, so then we've got the fool's knot. So a fool's knot is a knot, like in a rope or string or something like that appears to be a knot, but if you pull on the ends, it just dissolves, like it just falls apart. It appears to be a knot, but isn't really. And of course, there's also a pun, obviously, here on knot, K-N-O-T, and not, N-O-T. And the fool here is the fool of the tarot, who is numbered 0, but corresponds to their Aleph, which just has a value of 1. So we're going to see a lot of this 0 and 1 playing out here. So, O fool, begetter of both I and not. Right, and so this I here is also, of course, like the number, the numeral one. So the fool is the begetter of both I, like the self, the one, as well as the number one, like the tarot, as well as Kether, and then not, of course, is both this like primordial zero, as well as the number of the card, the fool. So, O fool, begetter of both I and not, resolve this naughty knot. And so naughty here, as Crowley says, it implies that there's like a sexual dimension to what's happening here, and there is, which we will see in a moment. But he's split it up into not E, right? So that not here, again, is referencing the zero or the void, the non-existent. So resolve this naughty knot, right? There's a knot or like a tangle of kind of difficulty, but it's a fool's knot. And so we'll see that if we pull on the ends, it wasn't really a knot or a tangle at all. All right, now we get really deep into the puns here, right? So we have O, right, which is a kind of exclamation. And Crowley had talked earlier about the idea that like the exclamation is in a way the truest form of speech. It's not a proposition. It's just an expression of surprise or awakening or rapture or orgasm or whatever else that this kind of, And there's actually a bunch of symbolism that he does for the O here, where the O represents Nuit, and then the point represents Hadit, and then the bar represents Rahurquit, or also the genitals, and the O is like the kates, the female genitals, the upper bar of the exclamation point is the male, and then the point is like the sperm. So there's a whole bunch of symbolism, like really densely, in all this stuff. So we have O, I, right? I being, again, a kind of pun on I, but also affirmation here. This I and O, right? So we have, or one, and which can also be read here as 1 and 0, which as we saw, is coming out of the symbolism of the fool as both 1 and 0, and as self and nothing from 61. And now he's going to put these two letters together. So I and O, and then he puts them together to spell yo, which is the cry of ecstasy, like in the mysteries of Dionysus or the Bacchic rites, right? The yo is the ecstatic cry to the god. So now these two things are being combined. The I and the not are being combined into an ecstatic divine cry. So I and O, yo, and then E-A-O, the kind of the full formula implied by I and O. And again, as we talked about, one way of reading the formula of E-A-O is to see the A as the child of I and O as mother and father. So again, some of that sort of sexual or procreative symbolism here. For I to Nibbana's O. So Nibbana here is nirvana. Nibbana is the Pali. Nirvana is Sanskrit, and Nibbana is Pali. But of course, Crowley knows Theravada Buddhism, so he always uses the Pali spellings. So like I have a debt of myself to now this OE thing with Nibbana. Crowley, I actually meant to look this up. I forget where he's actually getting this from, but he uses this as like the name of an island or meaning island, maybe in some language. I forgot to look up what that is. But this idea of an island here as a symbol of nirvana. So he's just maybe stretching it a little bit to get another O pun in here. But the idea that like the self is like owed to nirvana, because in nirvana, there is no self, right? And that's one way of talking about a classical Buddhist way of understanding what nirvana is like the realization of that there are no selves, and the ultimate, kind of non-self, the ultimate lack of selves in the world. So I to Nibbana's O, right? All right, and then so now because of this idea of owing or of having a debt, now we get the idea of I pay, right? Like paying a debt. But pay is the O, so the English letter O in Hebrew would correspond to ayin, right? Which corresponds to to Capricorn and to the devil of the tarot. And then the next letter in the alphabet is the letter pay. So now paying both is the idea of paying what you owe, but also as the next letter in the alphabet here. So I pay, and then pay, this PE here is the spelling of the Hebrew letter pay. The dissolution of the house of God, right? Because pay corresponds to the tower in the tarot, which shows the tower being struck by lightning. And of course, by the tower, we can understand that as a phallic symbol as well. And also just the idea of destruction or dissolution here, the dissolution of the self. the dissolution of that I or that one, the dissolution of the house of God. And the house of God is an older name for the tower card. For Pe comes after O. After Ayin, the triumphs over Aleph and Ein, that is O, because the letter name Ayin is spelled Ayin Yod Nun. And so the Ayin 61, meaning not, is Aleph Yod Nun. So that if you just replace the Aleph with an Ayin, then you get the letter name Ayin, which is also the word for an eye, like an the EYE, like an eye that you see with, which he's now going to then use that symbolism here as well. And now we have O and P. So like he put the I and the O together, he's going to put the O and the P together. And as that is the first two letters in opus, like the magnum opus, the great work. So opus, the work, the opening of the I. Right, and so I here, right, again, this is Ayin, the letter name Ayin, means I. So we have the opening of the eye, but this is also a reference to the eye of Shiva, and the idea that like the entire universe is just Shiva's dream, and that when Shiva opens his eye, when he awakens, the universe will be destroyed. And so Crowley uses this also as a symbol of the attainment of the great work of opening the eye that sort of reveals the ultimate like non-existence of things. So this is a symbol of the great work here, the opening of Shiva's eye that destroys the universe and sort of resolves everything back into that zero. It's like pulling the strings and dissolving the apparent knot, the fool's knot. All right, and then we get some more sexual symbolism coming in here in our second to last line here. Thou naughty boy, again, naughty there. Thou naughty boy, thou openest the eye of Horus to the blind eye that weeps. So the eye of Horus is a symbol that Crowley uses a lot for the anus, and the blind eye that weeps, of course, is another symbol of the phallus here. And so with this reference, now our sexual symbolism has shifted here to non-procreative sex, right? And so the idea of the non-procreative sex being used here is the idea of like attaining to nirvana as not creating any further karma. And so with the earlier symbol of like heterosexual vaginal intercourse, the idea that could lead to pregnancy, like that leads to something further. But the idea of the attaining nirvana by the extinction of the karma here is symbolized by like a non-procreative sexual act. And then this final line kind of confirms this. The upright one in thine uprightness rejoiceth. I think that's probably pretty obvious what that's about. And then the last line here, he says, death to all fishes. So death in the tarot corresponds to the letter Nun, and Nun means fish. Now he's also using fish as like a related to like the vesica piscis, right, which is a symbol of the yoni or of the womb. And so the idea here again of not creating pregnancy as a symbol of not generating any further karma. And then at the very end of the commentary, there's some more stuff too. I'm kind of simplifying. At the very end of the commentary, Crowley brags that he wrote this entire chapter in just a minute and a half while having dinner with friends, and that this is how well you must know your Kabbalah. And so whether that story is true or false, I think it does illustrate that, for Crowley, this stuff is really spontaneous. He's not like sitting down and like consulting tables and all this sort of stuff, that he really does know this language so well. And of course, all of his poetic faculties and his abilities with language and his knowledge of mythology and everything like that is just this vast like reservoir of stuff that he can just like condense, all of this material out of into a complex, silly, kind of annoying, sexual, but also like, expressing, what to Crowley anyways is a profound spiritual truth and the fruits of some of his highest attainments here, kind of all at the same time. All right, and then one last chapter here. Let's see, I may not go fully into detail about this one just because we're running out of time. But I just thought it was an interesting example of the way that we can take some of the techniques and even some of the material that we saw in the previous classes and extend it to new forms. So this is from chapter 86. You'll remember 86 as the value of the name Elohim. And we saw in particular how Elohim could be developed into a kind of pentagrammaton, so that the 5 letters in Elohim symbol, each represent one of the 5 elements. And so that's kind of being used as like the kind of template idea for what Crowley is going to do here. So he says, ex nihilo nihil fit, right? From not, nothing comes from nothing. But now nihil, the word nothing, Crowley's now interpreting as a formula. You can tell by the points here that Crowley's now interpreting the word nihil as a 5-lettered formula, and he's going to turn this nothing, this nihil, into a new kind of pentagrammaton, sort of on the model of Elohim. So these next 5 lines then break down the 5 letters of nihil. So he says, N, the fire that twisteth itself and burneth like a scorpion, right? So N, that noon, that's Scorpio. So that's where we get the scorpion from here, like burning like a scorpion. And of course, Scorpio is a water sign, but it's ruled by Mars, which is hot and dry. So he's kind of twisting the symbolism here, but getting N to represent fire. All right, and then I here, he says the unsullied, ever-flowing water. And so we have 2 I's here, and you'll notice that the second one there is the unsullied, ever-flowing air. And so I is, Yod, which is Virgo, right? And Virgo is the virgin. So this idea of being pure, unsullied is coming out of this Virgo symbolism. So he uses that as a way of getting at this idea of the pure water or pure air. And then the H in the center, the interpenetrating spirit, right? Because H is like the breath sound. And so spirit and breath are deeply connected. It's the same word for breath and spirit in what Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Sanskrit, probably a bunch of other languages as well. So H, or He, the interpenetrating spirit, without and within, is not its name abrahadabra? And we talked about abrahadabra just 2 weeks ago. All right, and then again, the second I, the unsullied, ever-flowing air, and then finally L, the green, fertile earth. And so this L here is Lamed, and so Lamed is earth in exactly the same way that Lamed and Elohim is earth, because Venus is the day ruler of the element of earth, the triplicity ruler for earth. All right, and then let's see, I'll just read the rest through quickly here. Fierce are the fires of the universe, and on their daggers they hold aloft the bleeding heart of earth. And so you kind of see that as like an interpretation of those 5 lines that we just saw. Upon the earth lies water, sensuous and sleepy. Above the water hangs air. So now we're kind of developing this pentagrammaton into like a cosmological sort of image. Above the water hangs air, and above air, but also below fire, and in all, the fabric of all being woven on its invisible design is aether. And then Crowley in a commentary goes into how aether, this 5-lettered word, it can also be turned into a pentagrammaton. But I'll leave you that. You can go and check it out in that chapter if you're interested in that. All right, so that was just a taste of the Book of Lies and the type of stuff that Crowley is doing here. If you like this stuff, the Book of Lies is a lot of fun, especially, if you're starting to get some facility with it. I think it can be a lot of fun, even just to kind of flip through like fairly randomly. There's no reason you have to read it, like in linear order. Just find chapter that maybe you understand a few things and try to puzzle some of the other stuff out. Read Crowley's commentary, and I think it's a really good sense of the type of stuff that can be done. And it's also just like an enjoyable read. Crowley can be quite funny at times, and then there's a lot of clever observations, and concealed within all the lies and puns and everything else, there really are some very profound expressions of Crowley's deepest philosophy there. And so I think it's a very valuable book that's worth time and study. All right, so now with the time we have left, which isn't that much, we will look at the way that some of these things also show up in the holy books. So I've just selected a few examples. We'll see, we might not get to all of them here, but yeah, we'll just look at a few examples. All right, so first is an example of some of the shorter holy books are, I think, the symbolism comes through very kind of clearly, where the name of the book indicates like the prime symbol, and then the whole text, this is for a lot of the holy books that are just like 2 or 3 pages long. The entire text kind of revolves around that single symbol. The longer texts like Liber 65 and Liber 7, they do a lot of different things, whereas the shorter holy books tend to cluster around like a single image or maybe a small set of images. And so those can be really clear. And so Liber Zadi is one here, where it's, again, it's just 2 or 3 pages long, and the letter Zadi really defines like the core image or set of images that the whole chapter turns around. So remember, the letter Zadi corresponds to Aries, right? And Aries is a fire sign ruled by Mars. The sun is exalted in Aries. It has a value of 90, and Zadi, it corresponds to the Emperor in the Tarot, and there you see the Emperor from the Thoth deck on the right there. And Zadi, the name Zadi has the signification of fishhook. And we can see some of this symbolism being used of the fishhook as like of hooking into something and lifting it up, of something being raised up, is a lot of the symbolism that we see in the book. So this is Liber Zadi, or Hamas Hermeticus here is the Hermetic fishhook. So it's, so again, that fishhook idea, and it's subfigure or under the figure 90. 90 is the value of Zadi. And it's significant, Zadi, the Emperor is number 4, and you can think of a square. It has, 4 sides, and each one of the angles is 90 degrees. And the Emperor like sits on the cubical stone. So there's a bunch of symbolism going on with that as well. And then I just chose like 4 verses from here where you can really see a lot of this symbolism very clearly. So you'll have to read the whole thing to get the whole. There's a kind of sequence, like kind of an initiatory sequence happening, and this is just kind of like the middle of that sequence. But we can see the symbolism, I think, really clearly. So we read, "With courage conquering fear shall ye approach me." So right off the bat here, we've got Mars, right? Courage conquering fear. That's absolutely, both fear and courage are very martial things. Because of course, courage can't exist if there isn't first fear, right? Courage isn't the lack of fear, but it's the overcoming of fear. So we've got Mars right away. "With courage conquering fear shall ye approach me. Ye shall lay down your heads upon mine altar, expecting the sweep of the sword." So, the sword is obviously a martial weapon. There's violence, there's a reference to decapitation here, obviously, which is a martial sort of thing. And also, we might also realize that Aries, in the zodiacal Malethesia, Aries corresponds to the head. So even this idea of the head being cut off also resonates with the symbol of Aries here as well. And this is sort of Horus or Rahur Queet speaking here, by the way, to like the initiate who's approaching him. So we say, you will lay down, your head upon my altar, expecting the sweep of the sword. "But the first kiss of love shall be radiant on your lips, and all my darkness and terror shall turn to light and joy." So now light and joy, coming again out of this idea of it's a fire sign, and the sun is exalted in Aries too. So now we get this sort of solar aspect of Rahur Queet. And of course, Rahur is a kind of synchronization of Ra, who's a war god, right? Mars, Ra, who's a sun god, right? The sun there, and then Horus, who of course, who is a martial god, right? For Mars. So Aries actually really is a perfect symbol for Rahur because it combines both the solar and the martial, as well as fire too. In chapter 3 in the Book of the Law, there's quite a bit of fire symbolism here. So the sign Aries really encapsulates a whole bunch of that. Also think of the fact that Saturn has fallen in Aries as well. This idea of like the darkness being like pushed away. That Saturn, which is so associated with darkness, doesn't do well in the very bright, fiery sign of Aries. So this is how some of the astrological symbolism can come in too here. All right, "Only those who fear shall fail," right? We already talked about the symbolism of fear. "Those who have bent their backs to the yoke of slavery until they can no longer stand upright, them will I despise. But you have defied the law," right? Defying the law is a very martial thing, right? Mars can be associated with crime and with the kind of the courage and the backbone to like defy an unjust law is a very, to put yourself in opposition to a power is a very martial sort of thing, but obviously a kind of positive, healthy expression of Mars. "But you who have defied the law, you have conquered," again, Mars, "by subtlety or force. You will I take unto me, even I will take you unto me." So we can see how, again, just that symbolism just coming out of just the letter Zadi and the image of the fish hook and everything really plays itself out over this holy book. And yeah, I suggest you go and read the whole thing and see the context and some of the other ways that symbol is developed in that book. All right, now here's an example from Liber 7, but just the idea, the way that this is part of like a longer passage. And so sometimes rather than having like a long passage that's all turning around like a single symbol, sometimes you'll have these symbols just being used, to express like a single idea in a larger sequence of ideas. And so this is just one example I chose from Liber 7 here that's pretty clear. Some of Liber 7 and Liber 65 also use these symbols in really like complex and even sometimes strange, sort of like paradoxical, almost like backwards sort of ways. And so in that sense, they're very advanced. The symbols are definitely kind of twisted and used against a lot of their sort of more standard senses. And so that can be, I think that's one way that Liber 65 and Liber 7 can be quite advanced texts, because you have to know the basic meanings. It's like, I don't know, like in jazz or something like that, you have to know the basic like scales and stuff like that to be able to understand how, people are like intentionally like, using notes that are outside, like chromatic notes and things like that. You have to kind of know the base to be able to deviate from it, right? So I think there's some of that happening there. But anyways, so just an example here. So there's a longer kind of sequence of ideas happening here. And then we read, resolve me the wonder of it all into the figure of a gaunt, swift camel striding over the sand. Lonely is he and abominable, yet he hath attained the crown. So crown here is obviously a reference to Kether, at the very top of the tree. And then the camel here, right? Camel is the meaning of the letter name Gimel. And we see that Gimel leads from Tefereth up to Kether. And the idea of the camel is used as a symbol of crossing the abyss. The abyss is often associated with the desert. And so the camel, as the animal that can cross through the desert, is sort of really perfect for Gimel here, right? Because Gimel is the path that crosses the abyss. And, it is the only path that connects Kether to any of the Sephiroth below the abyss, right? The only other two paths connect to Hokmah and Bina. So Gimel gets used as the kind of prime symbol for the crossing of the abyss, as well as for the Holy Guardian Angel. And so we can just see the way that symbolism of the camel and the abyss and the crown is being deployed here, just to express in these sort of as a kind of poetic image for that initiatory process. All right. So here's another example. So this is in similar way to Liber Zadi, where you have a central image and then the text kind of revolving around that central image, but it's a more complex image. So this is from Liber Aash. Aash is a Hebrew word spelled Ayin Shin, and it means creation. And so this is Liber Aash, or Capricornian Numetrici, which is the goat of the spirit. Under the figure 370. So Aash has a value of 370, right? Ayin 70 and Shin 30 for 370. And I think this is important as, among other things, 37 times 10, 37, the value of Yekida, associated with the self in Kether, multiplied by 10, the number of manifestation, expressing the idea of creation of Kether, manifesting the entire tree of 10 Sephiroth. And there's a lot of creation symbolism here, often in sexual terms in this text. So then I've laid out some of the symbols associated, or the correspondences associated with these two letters. So the letter Ayin, means I. It's associated with Capricorn in the tarot, Capricorn in the zodiac, and then the devil of the tarot. And then Shin means tooth. It's associated with both fire and spirit. Oh, that's where the triangle got pushed up there. Anyway, so fire and those are supposed to be parallel. So fire and spirit, and then the 20th Atu of the tarot, the Aeon. And so we see all this kind of playing out over the course of this book, but especially in verse 17 here. Now shalt thou adore me, who am the eye and the tooth, right? The eye and the tooth, the goat of the spirit, right? Capricorn is a goat, and then Shin, it corresponds to spirit. So Ayin Shin is understood as the goat of the spirit. The Lord of creation, Aash, creation. I am the eye in the triangle, the silver star that ye adore. So I'll leave that very last bit up for your own contemplation. But the idea of the eye in the triangle, again, we see ayin as eye, and then the symbol for fire, of course, is a triangle. So we could represent these letters as an eye in a triangle. And again, so you can. I think for this is a complex book, and there's a bunch of sort of complicated things happening here. There's a bunch of this book that I do not understand at all. But I think if you go into it with this, the Devil of the Tarot, some of these other associations with these letters, with even just the word Ash and some of its basic meanings, I think that can really go a long way to unpacking at least some of the basic meanings in that text. All right, let's see, how are we doing here? All right, so I'll do some of this book here, but not the full thing that I was going to do. We'll shorten a bit. All right, so this is Liber 813 or Liber Ararita. And so Ararita is a word that we've talked about in the past, and it has a value of 813. Now this is Liber 813 or Ararita under the figure 570. Now this is really interesting. Jim Eshelman talks about this in, I think it's in his book on the AA, that 570 would not, this was actually part of the, evidently, at least in this case, the title itself was part of the received material, because for Crowley, 570 wouldn't have been like a terribly important number. If you look up 570 in Sefer Sephiroth, there's a few interesting things there, but nothing that seems particularly relevant to the text. But by Latin Kabbalah simplex, which is just a Latin way, or the way of method for summing up Latin words as numbers, enumerating Latin, which Crowley didn't know. That was really developed by like Paul Fuster Case and some others. I mean, there's earlier precedents, but Crowley never used it. So 570 is the value of a very important alchemical phrase that you see there, and which we'll talk about in just a moment. So here's chapter 1 of the text. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but you're just reading the text with both the symbolism of Ararita, the 7-lettered name, the 7 planets, but the idea of drawing that 7 into one, to seeking the unity beyond duality, equating each idea with its opposite. That's all the symbolism of Ararita, and you can see that idea like playing out over the course of the chapters. But what's also really nice here is that the verse numbers also correspond. So let's see. So in verse 3 here, so verses 3 through 9 are all going to have exactly those planetary correspondences, as well as Sephirothic correspondences that we've been talking about here, right? So for 3 we associate with Saturn. Thou hast appeared unto me as an aged god, a venerable god, the Lord of time, bearing a sharp sickle, right? Thou hast appeared to me as Saturn. Then for verse, I just skip down to the end here, verse 9, right? So this is for the moon. Thou hast appeared unto me as an huntress among thy dogs, as a goddess virginal chaste, as a moon among the faded oaks of the wood of years, right? So images of Artemis and the moon here. So going through these, the idea that the one, the divine, the Adonai, the holy guardian angel, whatever, has appeared under the image of these planetary forms. Which are correlated to the verse numbers. And then so let's read on from verse 9 there. So you can go through and see how each one is an image of the planets, how 5 is an image of Mars, how 6 is an image of the sun, and so on. All right, and so then in verse 10 we read, but I was deceived by none of these, by none of these various, like apparently different separate appearances. But I was deceived by none of these. All these I cast aside, crying, begone, so that all these faded from my vision. Again, that symbolism of seeking the unity by destroying multiplicity. And then in verse 11 here, and again, 11 we'll remember as the number of the great work, the number of letters in the word abrahadabra. Also, I welded together the flaming star, right? The flaming star is the pentagram, 5, and the 6-fold star, the hexagram, in the forge of my soul, right? So the 5 and the 6, the microcosm and macrocosm, are being united, in this image of welding together the 5 and 6-fold stars in the forge of my soul. And behold, a new star, 418, that is above these all, right? 418 is the value of abrahadabra, the formula of uniting the microcosm and the macrocosm. And again, as we just said, abrahadabra has 11 letters. And this is verse 11. All right, and then verse 12, And yet even so I was not deceived, for the crown hath 12 rays. Right, so the 12 here, the crown, of course, is Kether, and 12 is the value of the divine name Hu, He, Vau, Aleph, right, which has a value of 12. And so 12 is also associated with Kether, as we saw a couple weeks ago. So, and yet I was deceived by none. Yeah, and even so I was not deceived, for the crown hath 12 rays. And then 13, which again, 13, the value of Achad, unity, love, 13, and these 12 rays are one. So you can see how the verses are almost, they're almost like comments on the numbers. And so this is the first chapter. There's 7 chapters, one for each letter in Ararita. And as it goes on, this like kind of basic, this is a very like straightforward chapter. As it goes on, it gets kind of more complex and more, other things start like coming in. But if you really start off reading it with that basic scheme in mind of the way that you're just sort of going through the numbers 0 to 13 in each verse, I think that'll be a great key to being able to understand what's going on there. All right, and then finally, I just wanted to just mention this thing about the 570. So by Latin Kabbalah simplex, 570 is the value of the phrase visita interiora terrae rectificando in venes occultum lapidem, which means something like, visit the interior of the earth, by rectification thou shalt find the hidden stone, right? Occultum lapidem is the hidden stone. So the hidden stone here, of course, is a symbol of the attainment of the great work, the philosopher's stone, right? All those kind of ideas. And so this is a 7-letter, a 7-word formula. Right, so again, we can think of this as being associated with the planets and all that. And so you visit the interior of the earth, kind of like go inside, go down, into matter, into the depths, into the self, all these ideas. Now, rectification is an alchemical process of purification by repeated distillations. So you distill something, whatever it is that you're rectifying. To rectify means like to make right, and so it's a process of purification. And so whatever it is that you're rectifying, you would distill it, and then you would take the distillate and then distill that again, and then take that distillate and distill it again, and you just do this over and over and over again as a really high form of alchemical purification. So visit the interior of the earth by rectification. You will find, the philosopher's stone, the stone of the wise, by the purification of the inner nature. Now, so this phrase, of course, is you can take the initials of these 7 words and spell out the word vitriol. So vitriol is a kind of 7-letter formula, very much like Ararita, right? And so now we can see the significance of that 570. Ararita is a 7-lettered formula, and 570 is also the value of this Latin 7-letter formula. And again, I think it's just really striking that Crowley would not have known this when he received the book. That is a really interesting thing. So anyways, vitriol here is again an alchemical substance. Vitriol is a name of, originally it was the name of iron or copper sulfate. Iron sulfate is known as green vitriol, and copper sulfate is blue vitriol. But then also iron and copper sulfate can be transformed into sulfuric acid. And so sulfuric acid, H2SO4, was originally known as oil of vitriol. And then later on in the alchemical tradition, it was sulfuric acid, just gets called vitriol. And so you can see this idea actually in some of, like in Liber 65 and some of the holy books, that image of like an acid that eats into steel. That's that idea of the vitriol, of dissolving the multiplicity in seeking the unity. And so this phrase in Latin is exactly what you see written in the kind of the halo around the central figure here in the art card in the Thoth deck. It's hard to read there, but there's that whole phrase is written right there as an alchemical formula. And we're not going to go into the symbolism of that tarot card right now, but you can think about how that formula and the meaning of the formula, and even the connection to Ararita, how that all relates to the alchemical process that's being depicted in this card here. It adds a really nice, a really important layer of depth to this card and its symbolism and its connection to the path of Samek and what Samek represents as a step in the initiatory process. There's really a lot there that you could reflect on. All right, and then we're just going to close out. Actually, we're doing pretty good on time. Yeah, if anybody has any, any questions or anything like that about, or any comments about any of the stuff we've done in this entire class series, I'm definitely happy to hang out for a few more minutes after. So I'll explain this last, or talk about this last text that I wanted to talk about here, and then yeah, if there's any comments or questions, I'd be happy to address those afterwards. All right, so last text here. This is another like shorter one, similar to like what I was talking about with Liber where the whole text really clusters around a basic image. And so this is Liber B. B, of course, is the English equivalent of Beth in Hebrew. Beth corresponds to the planet Mercury, as well as the magician or magus of the tarot. And that's the magician card that you see there on the right. So this is Liber B, well, magi. Now, magi here is, it just means magus or magician. It's not plural though. I thought earlier that it was magi. It was like, because magi can be the plural of magus, but it's actually just the genitive singular. So it's the book of the Liber Magi is the book of the magus or the book of the magician. So yeah, so Liber B or Liber Magi under the figure 1, right? Because the magician is Atu number 1, and so Beth. Mercury or the magician has a value of 2, but this card is numbered 1. And so in the text, we're going to see both, a lot of definite like Mercury and magician symbols, as well as a lot of play between the idea of the 1 and the 2. So let's see. I'll just go through these verses here. I just want to point out Beth on the Tree of Life is right here, connecting Kether to Binah. And yet the magus is also the title of the grade associated with Hokmah, which is right here. So the magus here we can see is on 2 places on the tree, connecting Kether and Binah and Hokmah, and we'll see that play out in these verses. So read 1 is the magus. Right, the magus is card number 1. Now that's the surface meaning. Of course, we can also talk about how why the magus is associated with unity, as a deeper thing that we can reflect on here. But the basic thing is just coming out of the number of the tarot card. 1 is the magus, twain his forces, right? Beth is a value of 2, and a lot of the symbolism of the path of Beth and the magus here is like the creation of the illusion of duality, the magician who weaves the illusion of multiplicity, or like weaves the illusion of Maya, right? Who kind of weaves the illusion of samsara, right? And so twain his forces, 2, of course, is just the value of the letter Beth, but 2, I think also you can read it as a symbol of duality. So 1 is the magus, but he wields the twin forces, the forces of duality. 1 is the magus, twain his forces, 4 his weapons, right? The 4 weapons that we see on the card there, the wand, the cup, the sword, and the disc. And so these 7, the 1 plus 2 plus 4, 7, these are the 7 spirits of unrighteousness, 7 vultures of evil. Again, this idea of multiplicity as like considered as evil as part of the like an initiatory process of seeking the unity behind them. These are the 7 spirits of unrighteousness, 7 vultures of evil. Thus is the art and craft of the magus but glamour, right? Glamour means like enchantment or illusion. That's the word. I mean, we now use that word to talk about fashion magazines or whatever. But the original meaning of that word was like an enchantment. This is the art and craft of the magus but glamour. Right, and we can think of kind of like fairy, it's associated with like fairy magic and things like that. But producing, making leaves look like gold coins and all that kind of stuff is kind of classic like glamour. So this is the art and craft of the magus, but glamour. How shall he destroy himself? Destroy himself to attain to Kether, to move from Hokmah to Kether. And so keep going on here. Yet the magus hath power upon the mother, both directly and through love. So this is Tree of Life symbolism here, right? So the mother, of course, is Binah. And so the path of Beth leads from Kether to Binah. So having power over the mother here is the idea that, the force is flowing downward, from Kether to Binah. But then also the magus in Hokmah, so that's power over the mother both directly, and through love, right? Because the path that connects Binah, the mother, to Hokmah, where the magus is the path of Daleth, and Daleth is Venus, which is love. So power of the mother both directly and through love. And the magus is love, and bindeth together that and this in his conjuration. So that kind of reflects some of what we were saying earlier about that as like a symbol of the absolute. So like the absolute and the I would kind of interpret this here anyways as a like where we are now, like the world of multiple things. So that, the absolute, and this, the conditioned world of separate things. But the magus as love, binding these things together, binding the two into one. All right, next verse. In the beginning doth the magus speak truth, and send forth illusion and falsehood to enslave the soul. Yet therein is the mystery of redemption. So again, this idea of truth and falsehood as in speaking truth, falsehood is also created. This is also the symbolism of the ape of Thoth, right? So that Mercury or Thoth as the god of truth and writing and all that is shadowed by this ape who perverts all of his words and spreads lies. But this being like the kind of the curse of the magus, this being that in speaking truth, lies are also told. And that, as we said, is one of the main themes in the Book of Lies that we talked about a little while ago. But the mystery of redemption here is talking about the return, of the two, like back to the one, but that the two emerging out of the one isn't some kind of like cosmic accident or mistake, but there's a mystery there that falsehood is produced in order for the process of redemption to happen, which really reminds me of that line in the Book of the Law. I am divided for love's sake, for the chance of union, right? That Nuit is speaking there. The idea of the creation of multiplicity, or at least the appearance of multiplicity as as again not an error, but a part of the cosmic process of movement away from unity, and then the return to it. All right, number 2, by his wisdom, wisdom, of course, is Chokmah. By his wisdom made he the worlds. Again, the idea of the magician as the creator of the worlds, of multiplicity. By his wisdom made he the worlds, the word, or logos, which is all the creative word, which is also associated with Chokmah. And again, speech and the magician and Thoth and all that, and Mercury. The word that is God is none other than he. All right, and then I just thought like verses 3 and 4 here were a nice way to close out this whole class series, where we've been talking quite a bit about speech and about words and about numbers and all this really busy kind of intellect ideas. I thought this was a nice sort of close. And we also began the series talking about Hermes and Thoth, and I thought it was nice to close the series with just a return to the image of that God. So verses 3 and 4 here. How then shall he end his speech with silence? For he is speech. He is the first and the last. How shall he cease to number himself? All right, so that that draws our class series to a close. I don't see any questions or anything, or any comments or anything like that coming in. If anybody has anything, please feel free to chime in. As always, for more about our work, you can visit tuts.org/FAQ. There's my email address if you want to contact me, and a PayPal address as always for $5 suggested donation for any non-members. I hope this class series has been interesting and useful in getting you started, with this type of Kabbalistic work and investigation. I enjoy doing it. And I hope you've enjoyed it, or if you've watched on YouTube, I hope you've enjoyed watching these and you've learned something. I'm going to take a break for a while, probably 6 months or something like that, from doing any more of these public webinars. But I've been talking to some of our other academic track instructors who are definitely interested in offering some webinars. So I don't know if we're going to see anything in November, but hopefully at least by December, we should have some other public classes taught by some of our other instructors coming in, who are all super awesome. So really excited for that, and for there to be some new voices and new perspectives in these classes as well. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already a member of our public Google group, please feel free to email me. I can add you that so that you can get an announcement when those came out, and it'll go up on Facebook too if you use Facebook. Anyway, sorry, it just reminded me of something. Never mind. I don't see any other questions coming in. So thanks everybody. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more, and stay tuned for more things to come. 93s, everybody. Take care.